Assalamu alaikum. I greet you with Muslim greetings of peace. My name is Osama Zahid. I'm a graduate student in bioengineering here at the University of Illinois, and I'll be moderating the session today. So again, I'd like to officially welcome you to the second event in the Prophetic Response Series, sponsored by the Central Illinois Mosque and Islamic Center, called The Prophet Muhammad and the Model of Sharia Pluralism. We are very happy to have Dr. Jonathan Brown here to speak with us tonight, but before that, I'd like to thank all our co-sponsors, the Center for South Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Illinois, the Muslim Students Association at the University of Illinois, the Muslim Students Association at Parkland College, and the First Mennonite Church of Champaign-Urbana. And just before getting started, just a few housekeeping notes. You should have been handed a survey when you were handing in, hopefully, a feedback form. This is because we're hoping to sponsor the Central Illinois Mosque and Islamic Center is hoping to sponsor more events like this in the near future, and your feedback is very useful to us in order to make sure to find out what we did well, what we didn't do well, so we can improve the events in the future. Be generous. And then just to let you know, the general format will be a formal talk followed by question and answer, so please do think about, if you have any questions, write them down, think about them. We are going to have a proper question and answer session at the end. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Irfan Ahmad, the Director of the Outreach Committee at the Central Illinois Mosque and Islamic Center and a member of the faculty here at the University of Illinois in order to make some introductory remarks.
Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum and good evening to everyone. I just wanted to thank you all for coming on behalf of the Central Illinois Mosque and Islamic Center Outreach Committee, which is organizing these talks, and have been doing that for a number of years, since about 25 years or so, as a beacon of being a community resource that the Central Illinois Mosque and Islamic Center is. And so, as part of these Prophetic Response Series, we have initiated these talks to engage the general community, and to have intellectual engagement with the rest of the community. And so this would be our third event or second plus one event, and we continue to do that. I would now invite Professor Valerie Hoffman, who is a Professor of Islamic Studies here at the University of Illinois and Director of Center for South Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, to introduce our speaker, Jonathan Brown.
Thank you, Irfan. It is a great pleasure to be invited to introduce Professor Jonathan Brown, and I would just really like to thank CIMIC for taking the initiative to organize an event like this and have a scholar of this caliber come, so thank you. Jonathan Brown is Associate Professor of Islamic Studies and Muslim Christian Understanding and is Associate Director of the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim Christian Understanding in the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Such a long title. He received his PhD in Islamic thought from the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago in 2006, just a little bit after I did. And Dr. Brown has studied and conducted research in a number of countries, including Egypt, Syria, Turkey, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Indonesia, India, and Iran. And he is a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He is the author of The Canonization of Al-Bukhari and Muslim, The Formation and Function of the Sunni Hadith Canon, published by Brill in 2007. And Hadith, Muhammad's Legacy in the Medieval and Modern World, published by One World Publications in 2009. And Muhammad, A Very Short Introduction, published by Oxford University Press in 2011. And he is also the author of Misquoting Muhammad, to be published by Oxford University Press. In addition to these books, he has published articles in the fields of Hadith, Islamic Law, Sufism, Arabic lexical theory, and pre-Islamic poetry. And he is the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Islamic Law. Dr. Brown's current research interests include the history of forgery and historical criticism in Islamic civilization, and modern conflicts between late Sunni traditionalism and Salafism in Islamic thought. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jonathan Brown.
Thank you. Is this working? Thank you very much to the university for inviting me. Thanks, Professor Ahmed, for taking the time and effort to coordinate this. It's an honor to be here with people like Professor Hoffman, whose article that I read in graduate school and used in my dissertation. And to be also here at a place for me, which is sort of a kind of mothership, I guess, because this is where the MSA was founded. And when I was in college and when I became Muslim, the first place I went was MSA. And that's where I met my first Muslim friends. And they took very good care of me and provided a wonderful environment. And I've had nothing but fond feelings and a commitment to the MSA wherever I end up being, whichever university I'm at. I always make sure to work with the students. I'm always so impressed by the Muslim students wherever I go. They're always so much initiative, so talented. They do such a good job representing their religion and taking care of their fellow students, and educating the university at large. I also see Sven. Hi, Sven. He was there probably around that time. So I want to first ask you, is this the Heartland? Are we in the Heartland?
Yes.
No? Okay. I'm going to say yes. I got a few yes. We're in the Heartland. That's good because I want to ask you questions. I want you to answer as representative Americans. Ask you theoretical questions. So let's say I belong to a religion. And this religion, this unusual religion, I have to dye my hair purple. Really bright. Does that bother you? Does not bother you. Why does it not bother you?
Because mine is on white.
Why does it not bother you?
Dye mine.
Huh?
As long as you don't try to make me.
As long as I don't try to make you dye yours. Okay. Now, I have a family. I have a couple of kids and a wife, and I raise them to dye their hair too. Dye their hair purple. Is that okay? Okay. I teach my children, because this is the tenet of my religion, as revealed in the great book of purple hair, descended from on high. Okay? I teach my children that other people who don't dye their hair purple they're misguided and they're going to hell. Okay? Does anyone is that okay with people? No. It's not okay. Why is it not okay? I don't get to decide. Yes.
I don't think you're being instructed that way, or going to treat other thinking people very respectfully.
Okay, so the children, if instructed like that, are not going to treat other people very respectfully. Thank God. I was so nervous that my little experiment here would yield results that were going to go against my thesis. But it turns out they fit in perfectly with my plan. Everything is going perfectly so far. As long as they don't pass out, things should be fine. Okay. This is interesting. This is an interesting idea. I would venture to say that it is widely accepted in the United States, not by everybody, but it is widely accepted in the United States, that people are free to have their own beliefs, provided they don't force their beliefs on others. Okay? And I would also say, provided that they do not believe or teach that those beliefs that distinguish us one from the other, or that one person may have and another person may not have, that these beliefs don't define our value in the world. Right? That whatever our differences in beliefs, we always have to acknowledge each other's value, each other's worth. And I would go so far as to say, and I think that I've been buttressed in this by the comments from the audience, that it is
probably not ideal to believe that other people are really completely wrong to the point that they are going to some awful place after they die. That really believing that other people's beliefs are completely wrong to the point that they're condemned to hellfire. This is something that we find unhelpful, possibly unacceptable in our society. Do you agree?
As long as we're academic.
As long as we're academic? Okay. Take that as a compliment. Then basically, we might disagree with each other, but we affirm each other's overall, the value of each other's beliefs. I don't agree with your religion, but I see that it's a good religion and it makes sense. You know, I affirm your religion. That we're not required just to tolerate each other in the United States, but we are actually required to affirm each other's beliefs. Would you agree with me?
No.
No. So, but if we say that if I teach you that, if I teach my children that anybody who doesn't dye their hair purple, they're going to hell.
It depends on what you teach them about how they're supposed to treat people who are going to hell.
Very good. Excellent. Okay. So, the United States is a diverse place. The gentleman over here slightly jumped the gun, but it's okay. Because I was watching, we all know it's, there's been a revolution in Egypt that's been going on for the past 18 months or so, right? And I was watching something on Egyptian television. It was very interesting. It made me think a lot. It was there was a panel with a couple of Coptic priests, so Christian priests, and there was a Salafi, so kind of very conservative Muslim leader, who was also on this panel. And the Coptic priests were very upset at the conservative Muslim leader because they said, they said to this conservative Muslim leader, you teach other people that we're unbelievers, that we're going to hell. And the conservative Muslim leader said, yes, I do. Because the Quran says that those people who deny the prophethood of Muhammad are unbelievers. And these people, according to the Quran, can expect a difficult fate. Right? And the Christian leaders were very upset by this. And people were calling in, Egyptians were calling in, and saying, we're upset by this, we don't want other Egyptians treated like this, we don't accept the idea that an Egyptian would go to another Egyptian and say, you're an unbeliever. And what did the conservative Muslim leader say? He said something which I really never thought about. I feel kind of silly, but it really made me think. He said, of course I don't agree with your religion, and you don't agree with my religion. You also think I'm going to hell, because I don't believe in Jesus Christ and the Christian religion. But what does that have to do with how we treat one another? This has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not I'm nice to you or not nice to you. And the fact that I believe that your religion is wrong, or the fact that I believe that you're misguided, or the fact that I believe you're going to hell, doesn't mean that I'm going to hurt you, doesn't mean that I'm going to take your property, doesn't mean I'm going to be rude to you. And I realized that here was a kind of another model for how we think about pluralism, how we think about different groups in society. In the United States, and in Western Europe as well, there's a very strong idea, not exclusive, there's a very strong theme in society, which is that people have to love one another. People have to respect one another. People have to respect one another's beliefs. People have to be tolerant. People don't want to judge other people. I think these are all, these ideas are probably very familiar to you. But this also has an interesting consequence, which means that we maybe have to pretend we agree with people when we don't. We have to pretend we affirm other people's beliefs when in fact we don't. We have to pretend that we all share the same core beliefs when in fact we might not. So the model that this conservative Muslim scholar was proposing was a model that's not based on shared beliefs. It's based on saying, listen, we totally disagree with each other. But beliefs have nothing to do with the way you treat one another. Because society isn't based on loving each other or agreeing with each other. Society is based on rules that people follow. Society is based on shared notions of obligations, shared notions of rights. So one of the priests got very upset at the Muslim scholar. He said, "You don't love me." And the Muslim scholar said, "You're right, I don't love you. I don't know you. And I also don't love the guy who sells me bread in the morning. And I don't love the person who's driving the bus. And I don't love the person that I go and buy mobile phone minutes when I recharge my phone. But it doesn't mean that I'm going to go and steal the mobile phone minutes from his store or grab the wheel of the bus and drive it into a bridge embankment or something like that. And I'm not going to go and sneak and take the bread away from the man who's selling it to me in the morning." Our interactions with each other are not based on whether we love each other or not. Our interactions are based on rules of society. And so I thought to myself, that's really interesting. How did this idea come up that we have, that love is part of social interaction? Because I think to myself, I don't really love most people I interact with either. I don't know them. And if I do know them, sometimes I don't like them. So when we talk about different models of pluralistic societies, we have maybe one model which is based on the idea of mutual respect for each other's beliefs, affirmation of each other's beliefs. And core to this idea, as this gentleman here brought up very insightfully, is the idea that if we don't respect each other's beliefs, that is going to lead to mistreatment. That if we don't respect each other's beliefs, if I really teach my children that everybody who doesn't dye their hair purple is going to hell, that is somehow going to create a society that none of us want to live in. It's going to create a society filled with hatred. It's going to create a society in which people mistreat each other. And so the urge to create respect between different systems of belief, the urge to have people try and erase these differences, is really driven by the goal or by the desire to live in a society that is peaceful, prosperous, not rancorous. The other model, which is being proposed by this conservative Muslim scholar, is that it's foolish to pretend that different religions are going to agree with each other all the time. If you take two religions and force them to erase the differences between the two, you end up with one religion. You don't end up with two religions anymore. And if people believe, if some people at least believe, that having a distinct religious community, having your distinct religious tradition that you believe is right, and that you're going to cling to, if people believe that that is good, that that's important in life, then they don't want to erase the distinctions between religions. They don't want to live in a world where everybody agrees all the time. Because that's a world where no tradition exists that makes claims to transcendent truth. So, what I'm going to talk to you about is about the kind of Islamic model, which is actually very close to what this somewhat unpopular conservative Muslim scholar was saying. It's a model that is based on recognition of rights, responsibilities, obligations that exist between people in society, that connect people in society regardless of what those people's beliefs are. And we could go back and look at Islamic law, we could look at the history of Islamic civilization, and I'll look at a few examples of that, but I think it's really easiest to go back and look at the life of the Prophet Muhammad, the founder of Islam. So I'll give you examples from his life. When we talk about this issue of treating each other respectfully, how can we live in a society where people disagree with each other completely on core issues of identity, about right and wrong, about truth and falsehood, about whether there's a God or not? How can you have such a society in which people also treat each other respectfully? The Prophet Muhammad taught his followers very clearly that rights and obligations exist regardless of these disagreements. So in one saying of the Prophet, Muhammad, for those of you who don't know, Muslims usually don't call Muhammad Muhammad. They call their brother Muhammad because that's probably his name. But they usually call, the Prophet Muhammad, they call him the Prophet or the Messenger of God. So I'll refer to him as the Prophet. That's what I'm speaking about. He said, there's three kinds of neighbors. There are three kinds of neighbors. There is a neighbor who has one right. He has one right. And this is the polytheist neighbor. This is the neighbor who worships idols, or who worships a religion, follows a religion that's not a monotheistic religion. Okay? He has the right of a neighbor. We'll talk later about what that is. He has the right of a neighbor. There's another neighbor who has two rights. Parkland in Arabic, two rights. The right of being a neighbor and the right of being Muslim, because this is your Muslim neighbor. There's another neighbor who has three rights. This is a neighbor who is your neighbor, he's Muslim, or she's Muslim, and this person is also your relative. So they have the right of a Muslim, they have the right of a neighbor, and they have the right of kin. And just to describe a little about how Muslim scholars in the past understood the notion of a neighbor, some Muslim scholars said that it was everybody from 40 houses down. 40 houses away from your house in every direction. It's a lot of houses. It's a big neighborhood. Or it's all the people who hear the same call to prayer from the mosque. All those people are your neighbor. So what are a neighbor's rights? What are the rights of a neighbor in Islam? Again, a saying from the Prophet Muhammad explains this. The right, and I'm translating, I'll read it to you in Arabic, but if you're bored, those of you who don't know Arabic to death, I will translate it. The right of a neighbor is if he becomes sick, you visit him. And this could also, I'm going to say he, but it could be she too. If this person becomes sick, you visit them. If they die, you console their family. If they ask you for a loan, you give them money. If they become destitute and in need, you help meet their needs. If something good happens to them, you congratulate them. If something bad happens to them, you console them. Don't raise your house up, like build more floors on your house, so that it blocks the wind from getting into their house. And don't cook some tasty food where the smell of your food is drifting into their house, unless you go and offer them some of the food. Right? Those of you who live in the dorm may face this problem from time to time when your neighbor's cooking some especially tasty ramen. People still eat ramen in college? Okay, is that what they call it? I lived with them. So this is very interesting. Now, I don't even know my neighbor's name. I don't know any of my neighbor's names. When we had this horrible windstorm in the summer in Washington, D.C., this is the first time any of us ever saw each other. And in one case, it was because the neighbor behind me called the police several times because they thought my generator was too loud. Instead of coming and saying, can you turn down the generator, they actually called the police twice, 2 days in a row. And the police didn't do anything. But I mean, this is a typical, unfortunate example of American suburban life, where instead of, God forbid, actually confronting your neighbor and saying, hey buddy, can you turn the generator down, you call the police and have the municipality charge thousands of dollars to send them over. So this right of the neighbor is extensive. I think you would all agree this is an extensive rights that the neighbor enjoys. They get food, money, consolation, congratulation. Their house doesn't get obstructed by a part of your house. This is the right of any neighbor. This is the right of a Muslim neighbor. This is the right of a non-Muslim neighbor. This is the right of a neighbor who's going to hell. This is the right of a neighbor who's going to heaven. And this is in addition to the rights that they would have as a fellow Muslim, that the rights that they would have as your kinsman. And just to give you another idea, the Prophet said in another saying, by God, none of you believes fully until he wants for his neighbor what he wants for himself. Okay. What about, we've talked about neighborly rights and kindness. What about how we actually interact with each other in society? What about transactions and trade? It's interesting, the Prophet Muhammad, this is the city of Medina. This is actually the mosque in which the Prophet is buried in Medina in Saudi Arabia. And this is the graveyard of the Muslims right outside the mosque. And this actually is an area, part of the city of Medina. Sorry, at the bottom of the pictures are real pretty, but these are palm trees in Medina. There were at least, when the Prophet arrived in Medina in 622 of the Common Era, at least half the population of the city was Jewish. So the Prophet's community, the Medinan community, was at least half Jewish for many years. And when the Prophet came there, they came to an agreement that all the tribes of the city, whether they're Muslim or pagan, Arab, or Jewish, they would all make war together, make peace together, and that they would all take any problems they have, and the Prophet Muhammad would adjudicate them. They borrowed and traded with each other all the time. In fact, when the Prophet died, he had actually borrowed food from, I mean, this was the situation he was in. He had borrowed food from a Jewish member of the Medinan community, and actually had left a suit of armor with that family, with that Jewish family, as collateral. So they're lending and borrowing with each other. In fact, even in some of the wars that the Muslims fought, they enlisted the help of non-Muslims. So when the Muslims retook the city of Mecca, from which they'd been driven years earlier by the oppressive tribes that ruled Mecca, when they took back Mecca, their enemies fought another battle against them. And in order to meet those enemies, they needed money. And the Prophet actually borrowed a significant amount of money from someone who was not Muslim at all, who was actually a pagan, a polytheist, who worshipped idols. So there was not a problem in dealing with them. The Prophet Muhammad, during his lifetime, actually concluded treaties and agreements with every kind of person. The Muslims, when they were, the teachings of Islam were being developed in Mecca, the Muslims were oppressed by the Meccan elites who did not like the idea of monotheistic religion. So a number of the Muslims, over 80 Muslims, went and sought refuge in Ethiopia, across the Red Sea. And they sought refuge with the Christian king of Ethiopia, who was known for his just policies, and the Muslims knew they would be treated well. And they were treated well, and they stayed there for several years. So Muslims actually went and sought refuge with non-Muslims. The importance of treaties was supreme with Muslims. So the Prophet Muhammad had treaties with Jewish tribes, he had treaties with Christian cities, he had treaties with polytheist Arabs. And in fact, treaties were so important that they even trumped one's duty to help fellow Muslims. And a famous example of this is when the Muslims were going out to fight their enemies at a battle called Badr, the first big battle between the Meccans and the Muslims and their Meccan enemies. The first big battle in the year 624, the Common Era. The one Muslim named Hudayfa bin Yaman went out to try and join up with the other Muslims to fight in the battle. And he was intercepted by some of the Meccan enemies. And they said, "Are you going to fight with Muhammad?" He said, "Yes, I was going to do that, but now I'm actually going to go back to Medina." And they said, "Okay, go back to Medina." And he went back to Medina. And they said, "We'll take your word on this." He said, "Yes, I will not go and fight. I'm going back to Medina." So he went back to Medina, and on the way he met the Prophet and the Muslims who were actually going out to the battlefield. And he told the Prophet Muhammad what happened. And he said, "Okay, you've given them your word, go back to Medina." By the way, the Muslims were outnumbered 3-1 in this battle. Every last man, every additional man would have been useful. But the Prophet Muhammad sent Hudayfa back to Medina because he had given his word not to fight. What about things that are more spiritual, more existentially important? Like affirming the value of a person who's not Muslim's life, affirming the life of Muslims. Muslims also did this, during the life of the Prophet. So, after the Prophet died, the Muslim armies expanded out of the Arabian Peninsula. And in one battle, after the battle was over, there was the enemy was carrying one of their dead soldiers away. And two of the Muslims, as they were carrying the body by, they stood up for the body as it passed by. And another Muslim said, this person is not Muslim. This person is in fact Zoroastrian, the Persian religion. They're Zoroastrian. They're not Muslim. And the two Muslims who stood up said, we were with the Prophet Muhammad, and a Jewish person's funeral passed by. A Jewish person died. And the Prophet stood up for that. And we said, why are you standing, O Prophet of God? And he said, Alaysat binafs? Is this not a soul? Is this not one of the souls given by God? There's also respect for religious traditions taught by the Prophet Muhammad. Now, this doesn't mean that Muslims agree with everybody's religion. This doesn't mean that the Prophet Muhammad agreed with everybody's religion. He built his religion, he began his teachings to correct what he felt were incorrect religious practices and ideas around him. But that doesn't mean that he didn't recognize the value of those traditions to their own adherents. And in one case, when the Muslims captured a Jewish city called Khaybar, I think I might have some Jews nearby. Oh, there's a camel, by the way. Those are camels for milking, not for eating. Camel milk, very good. Roadside camel milk. This, I forgot. The place would have looked like this, but it's not this place. When the Muslims captured the city, they found a huge stash of Jewish texts, of old Jewish texts written in Syriac and Hebrew, and they kept them. And years later, when some Jewish envoys came to visit the Prophet, they returned these texts. They kept them for them. They didn't destroy them. They didn't desecrate them and say this is from a religion that we don't accept. When Christians from this city, this is the city of Najran. Najran is right now right on the border between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, southern Arabia. City of Najran. There's old houses in the city of Najran. When Christians from the city of Najran came to visit the Prophet, a delegation of them to basically make a treaty with him, which they did. When the time came for them to pray, for the Christians to pray, the Prophet Muhammad instructed all the Muslims to leave the mosque, to go outside, and allow the Christians to conduct their prayer in the mosque. So if these communities are living side by side in a place like Medina, where you have Jews and Muslims and polytheist Arabs all living together, how do they adjudicate their disputes? It's easy to talk about people getting along or respecting one another's rights, but what happens when people disagree over what those rights are? In the case of Medina, in the case of Arabia at the time of the Prophet, there was actually a shared culture. The Jewish Arabs, I know that sounds contradictory, but Jewish Arabs, the Muslim Arabs, and the polytheist Arabs, they all shared the same culture. They all shared the same notions of what justice is. And justice in Arabic is adl, or adal. Adl is from the same root as idl. Idl is half a camel load. So you can imagine there's a camel. Wait, that's not the camels. Half a camel, so a camel load is on both sides of their body. And justice is when they're balanced. Right? Otherwise, the camel's going to flop over this side or flop over that side, or the boat's going to fall. So justice actually comes from the same root as these camel, half or camel boat. So justice is equity. Justice was, in the time of the prophet, everybody getting what their due is. Everybody getting their due. Everybody getting their due. And in fact, oftentimes, the Quran, the Muslim holy book, it doesn't often go into the details of what right and wrong are. Instead, it says, God commands you to be just and to be good. When it talks about marriage, it says either stay married according to what's right, or send your spouse away, divorce your spouse with goodness. These terms, they're not, you can imagine what's right and what's good in one place is different from what's right and what's good in another place. What's right and what's good in one situation can be different from what's right and what's good in another situation. Now, this doesn't mean that in Islam, Muslims believe that what's right and what's good is dependent on where you live. So, for example, Muslims believe that it's always wrong to drink alcohol. It's always wrong to get drunk. That doesn't matter if in your society it's normal or not. In America, it's completely normal to drink alcohol, completely normal to get, maybe not totally drunk, but it's a little bit tipsy. Okay, this is totally normal. But this doesn't make it right. Because right and wrong for Muslims is defined by those values that were prevalent at the time of the Prophet, the teachings of the Prophet. That introduces the challenge of figuring out how these values should be understood and implemented in other societies, and that's the great challenge that Muslim scholars have faced throughout history. But we can see how important this notion of justice was at the time of the Prophet. That this notion of justice transcended all the religions. So there was one point when the Prophet was dividing up some of the goods that had been captured in a battle. And this man said to him, "You have perished. You have perished if you are not just in dividing up the spoils." This is very aggressive speech to be directed at the prophet of God. But he didn't get upset. Because what was this man saying? He said, you have to be just in how you divide these things up. The importance of justice and the notion of justice united all the religious groups over which the prophet ruled in Medina. And there was one instance in which a companion of the prophet, who was Muslim, came to him and said, I'm disputing with this Jewish person. We're disputing over land. He's taken land from me. This is my land. And the prophet asked the man for evidence, the Muslim for evidence. Do you have any evidence? No, I am telling you this is what happened. I'm Muslim, and I'm telling you what happened, and he's Jewish, and he took my land. And the prophet asked the Jewish man, do you swear that you did not take this land? The Jewish man swore, I did not take this. This is my land, originally. The prophet says, okay. The Jewish man keeps his land. And the Muslim got very upset. He said, you know, how can you rule on behalf of this, for the sake of this Jewish man? I'm Muslim. But the fact of the matter is that it is in the procedure of justice at the prophet time. If you have evidence, evidence beats an oath. But if someone doesn't have any evidence, all the defendant has to do is swear that they're innocent of the charge, and they're cleared of any potential wrongdoing. Doesn't matter what their religion is. And it's actually really interesting that later on in Islamic civilization, in Baghdad in the 800s and 900s, Baghdad was a city built by Muslims in the 760s of the Common Era. You had great Jewish communities and Christian communities in Baghdad. In fact, the two most important centers of Jewish study in the world, of rabbinic study, from the 500s all the way up until the 1000s of the Common Era, were in Baghdad. The academies of Suru and Pompedita. Now, the many of the Jews and Christians in Baghdad actually ended up going to the Islamic courts in Baghdad, the Sharia courts, in order to register their land, in order to register their marriages. If women wanted to get a divorce, sometimes they'd end up going to the Sharia court to get a divorce instead of going to the rabbinic court. Because, one, the Muslims were the authorities in charge, and if the Muslim judge had a ruling, that ruling could actually be enforced. But two, they trusted the procedure of Muslim courts. And Muslim scholars, Muslim judges in those courts, accepted the evidence. They would sit there and arbitrate between a Jewish man and a Jewish woman over an issue of divorce, or between two Jewish men over an issue of a sale gone bad. So, having discussed this, I would ask you to think about how does this. Now, I earlier asked you as Americans from the heartland to answer questions. I want you to think about whether or not this, the model of the Prophet Muhammad, whether or not this would meet the requirements of modern American society. Are these two systems compatible? If they're not compatible, why are they not compatible? When we talk about, when I gave you the example of the purple hair dye, I was surprised. Well, this gentleman said I shouldn't make him dye his hair purple. Can I try and convince you to dye your hair purple?
Try.
I can try.
He's a lawyer.
But ultimately, I have to respect what? I have to respect your autonomy. Now, I gave you. I was surprised nobody reacted because I said I have children, and I teach them to dye their hair purple. What happens a few years later when the children become 18, let's say? What then happens? Do I have the right to still tell them to? Can I still tell them to keep their hair dyed purple?
You can tell them.
Well, but what do we assume will happen?
You can tell them, but you can't make them listen.
Of course. So there's this. One of the central ideas I think in American liberalism, and I don't mean liberalism as Democrats versus Republicans. I mean sort of general American liberal, the polity in which we live. The idea that there's no metaphysical claim that runs our society. We all sort of try and make arguments about what's right and what's wrong based on evidence that we all accept. One of the important ideas is autonomy. That individuals have to make their own decisions about religion. That nobody can make a decision for somebody else. This is obviously I think a central core. And what this causes is that one of the things that Americans generally tend to object to in other countries are things like control over religion. Somebody saying that you can or can't, somebody can't change their religion or can't have a certain religion or can't practice a certain religion or can't preach a certain religion. Now in the Islamic tradition, apostasy or leaving Islam, a Muslim abandons Islam, this has historically in Islamic civilization been a very serious offense. This has been considered by most Muslim scholars to be in fact capital offense. Now, this seems to be a major point of non-compatibility with American political ideals. But it's very interesting because there's also some examples from the life of the Prophet which give us a slightly different picture. When the Prophet was in the city of Medina, which he ruled as basically the chief of the city, a man came from Mecca who became Muslim. His name was Abdullah ibn Sa'd. He became Muslim, and he actually became one of the scribes of the prophets, who would write the prophet's messages and things, because the prophet Muhammad was illiterate. And eventually he decided he didn't like Islam anymore, and he went back to Mecca. He abandoned Islam, he said, I'm not Muslim anymore. He went back to Mecca. He wrote nasty poetry insulting Muslims and insulting the prophet. Later on, he became Muslim again. And in fact, after the Muslims conquered Egypt, he was made the governor of Egypt. This does not seem to concur with the apostasy as a death penalty offense narrative that I just gave. not only did he apostatize, but he became an enemy agent against the Muslims. And later on, not only was he accepted back into Islam, but he was made a governor of a major province. It's very interesting. During the life of the Prophet, and during the early years of the Muslim community, I can't think of any person who was actually killed for leaving Islam. And this is because the way that people understood apostasy was more a matter of allegiance to a state or to a community than about personal conscience. In fact, Muslim scholars throughout Islamic history generally didn't care what people actually believed in their hearts. They didn't care what they did in their homes. They didn't care whether they were sincere in their prayers or whether they sat at home and drank alcohol. It didn't matter. What mattered was your public behavior. If you came out and were criticizing the Prophet Muhammad, insulting him, insulting the Quran, insulting Islam, trying to rile people up against their religion, this was a major offense for Muslim scholars. Because they saw this as a threat to their order, to their polity. It wasn't a matter of personal conscience. So this has led many Muslim scholars in the modern period, Muslim scholars today, and I'll give you some names, very influential scholars like Yusuf al-Qaradawi, like Sheikh Ali Jum'ah, the Mufti of Egypt, and others, to say that we have to distinguish now in a world where allegiance isn't to a religion. If you lived in medieval Europe in the 1200s, you belong to Christendom. You're a Christian, first and foremost. If you lived in the Muslim world in, let's say, Syria in 1300, your identity was a Muslim. You lived in the abode of Islam. That was the chief polity to which you belonged. And leaving that religion was almost an act of treason to that polity. Now we don't live in a world like that. Now we live in a world in which religion is a private matter, in which one's loyalty is, or one's identity is determined mostly by your nation state, maybe by your city or by your culture. And in this case, there's no reason to treat apostasy so severely. So in a lot of ways, the apostasy that Muslim scholars considered so dangerous is more similar to maybe high treason today. Now, I'm eager to hear your thoughts on whether or not you think the model that I described is incompatible, compatible, semi-compatible with what the Americans expect, what Americans want, and where you think the differences are. I'm eager to hear that, and I'll also answer any other questions you might have.
Yeah, so we can start taking questions now. Show of hands. Okay. Good. If you can speak up, or I can pass the microphone.
Yeah, I can just speak up. I'm curious. There are a lot of groups, particularly the Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia. How would you feel that they would take an approach to a more classical understanding of Muslim Judeo-Christian relations, particularly in a more modern light, as opposed to classical?
Yeah. So, I'm curious. What did you think of remember the scholar I told you about with the two priests on TV? Right. Were you here for that?
Yeah.
What did you think about what he was saying? Was it on a crazyometer, like 10 or 1? 1 being not crazy, 10 being totally insane.
He seemed like a very progressive in terms of relations, but not very progressive in terms of his understanding of faith. So I'm more interested in how you think that will evolve within the understanding of Wahhabis.
Okay, well that scholar is a Wahhabi scholar. So that would be the position of Wahhabi scholar on interfaith relations. in the sense of actually how we relate to one another practically. In terms of faith, I mean, there are some Muslim scholars who argue that other religions are, that somebody can follow and someone can learn about Islam. Let me back up. So if somebody doesn't know anything about Islam, they live off in the mountains of Peru or something, never heard of Islam, they're not held accountable. And for Muslims, God will judge them on the Day of Judgment. We don't know what's going to happen. But they're certainly not going to be held accountable for not being Muslim because they didn't know what Islam was. If they live in, let's say, a city in the middle of the United States and they never meet Muslims, and the only Muslim they meet is some really horrible alcoholic guy who's always beating people up at a bar, okay? And all they see about Islam is, 9/11 and terrorism this and terrorism that. They're also not held accountable for rejecting Islam because they had absolutely no reason to become Muslim. Why would someone become Muslim if this is what they knew about the religion? They have not been communicated the religion in the proper way and a reliable way. However, if somebody learns about Islam in the proper way, they understand the religion, and if they still choose not to accept that religion, whether or not they pray or not doesn't matter. What they say or not doesn't matter. But in their heart, if they don't accept their religion, then according to all Orthodox Muslim scholars that I know, all Muslim scholars, serious Muslim scholars, would say that person will be punished by God on the Day of Judgment, probably with hellfire. Now, God can forgive, it's totally up to God. God can forgive that person, or this is not in our ability to judge. But we would, as a Muslim scholar, would say this person is an unbeliever. So, when you say a more progressive approach to faith, the vast majority of Muslim scholars aren't of the school of thought that there's some inherent good in erasing the differences between religious traditions. If someone says, I believe that Muhammad is not a prophet, I don't accept his prophecy, some scholar can't accept this person as, that's a rejection of the message of Islam. If that person says, I believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that God actually had a son, this is a big theological problem for Muslim scholars. They can't accept that. What's going to happen to this person in the afterlife? God knows. No human being knows. But there's not really a way to accept that belief as valid. Now, a minority of Muslim scholars argue that, well, let's look behind what the particularities of a religious tradition, and let's look for common notions of truth. So in that case, for example, in Hinduism, if you look at on the surface, there is not much of you can't get much more different than Islam, where you can't portray God in any way whatsoever or worship any idols, and Hinduism, or the Hindu religious families, where there's lots of portrayals of God, and 10, 20, 30, 40, 100,000 different gods. It seems to be totally opposed to one. But if you look behind those particularities, you see significant similarities. Right? Why do Muslims not portray God? Because they believe God is too great to be portrayed. Why do Hindus create idols? Because God is too great to be portrayed. Brahman, the idea of the divine force in the world, is too great to be portrayed. Nothing you do can possibly portray this force. So whatever you do, have a guy with a pitchfork, or have a person whose skin is blue, or have a monkey, or an elephant. It doesn't matter. None of these things, any attempt to portray God is as silly as any other attempt. None of them can possibly portray the divine force in the world. And that's why, Hindu saints in the medieval period, one saint was asked by his students, how many gods are there? And he said, I can't remember the exact number, like 100,000. And the student said, no, tell me, please, how many gods really are there? He said, 200,000. How many gods really are there? 300,000. It doesn't matter. because these things are all just imperfect reflections of the divine reality. So some Muslim scholars, this is a small minority, would argue for looking beyond the particularities at core similarities. I know that's a long answer, sorry about that.
Go back.
Yeah, throughout the lecture, we were discussing interaction that practical down to wishes. But I just wanted to question, on what basis are these interactions? You said there's a common ground. It's almost very vague. What common grounds are there? Because as Muslims, does everything derive from our religion? Or at least in this society, everything's derived from law, constitution and whatnot. Is that necessarily compatible with Islam? Because if that were the case, then our religion wouldn't necessarily be Islam. It would be secularism, where we believe in these almost third-party actor gods, which don't have much control over anything. What do you think?
Well, I mean, that's interesting. Do you really think our interactions with each other are based on law in the United States?
Yeah, it seems.
I mean, how many times have you been to court?
It seems to be based on common laws, things that are given.
It's based on what's called urf in Arabic, on custom. I mean, I've thank God I've never been to court. Yes, I've never been to court.
Are you married?
Yeah. Oh, is that a court?
No, but if you're married, then that has.
I wasn't in court. It was some other
No, it's
room.
because of the legal
Yeah.
institution of marriage that you enjoy the rights of being married, not because of whatever you might believe about marriage.
The rights of being married, like tax rights?
Whatever they may be. Whatever those rights are in our society, they're because they're
No, okay,
defined by
but
law, not by personal
certain rights I enjoy. I enjoy because I have a Sharia marriage with 2 witnesses. It's acceptable in Islam. Other rights, like tax deductions and things like that, I get because I'm married in the court. So my point is that our interactions with each other in the United States are mostly based on custom. And-
So then, are we saying that custom is the dictating force, which is superior to religion?
No, okay. In Islamic law, there's 5 core, it's called maxims, 5 juridical maxims that are kind of govern the way that Muslim scholars, legal scholars think about law. One of them is al-'adl muhakkama. Custom is supreme. Custom rules all. What does that mean? That doesn't mean that custom makes everything right. Like I said before, there's no situation, unless you're dying of thirst in the desert and you come across, a mini bar that's fallen out of an airplane full of little bottles of vodka, right? Anything besides that situation, you can't drink alcohol. It's a sin to drink alcohol. It's a sin to get drunk. Doesn't matter what custom is. So there's certain things that are prohibited or required by the Prophet's injunctions or by the Quran. Aside from that, however, things are governed by custom, even in Islamic law. So let's say in most schools of Islamic law, if we're conducting I forgot your name. Nabil. Nabil and I are conducting a transaction. Nabil is selling me this roll of tape. Okay? And we conduct the transaction. We are allowed, either of us are allowed to rescind or cancel this transaction until we part company. Until we part company. What does parting company mean? Does that mean the end of the working day? Does that mean when I walk away? What if we're walking in a market and this is a mall and I walk away to another stall and then I come back? Am I still allowed to avoid this transaction? So like return policies, right? This is based on custom. Depends on what country you're in. So much of Islamic law, when I got married, okay, Muslim men have to pay their wife a dowry, a bride price. They have to give their wife money or something. Even if it's a pen, they have to give them something. Right? And my wife was not going to accept a pen, so I had to give her more than that. So you have to give your wife. How is this determined? This is determined also by custom. What is the custom in your country, your community, in your social class even?
justice something heavily ingrained in Islam. Just because it happens to align itself with our current custom, I don't think that necessarily is derived from some.
What's justice? How do you define what justice is? Justice is defined differently from time to time and place to place. And to the extent that Islamic law is determined by custom, and much of it is, local notions of justice will determine that. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to say that. I'm not trying to pretend that Islamic law is no, it's okay. Just do whatever you want, wherever you are. It's okay. I'm not trying to say that. There's some very, very firm rules in Islamic law. There's very firm rules. Okay, but around those rules, between those rules, in the details of those rules, these things are determined by custom and determined by notions of justice that are determined by custom. Yes. Okay.
My question is that you gave a model of pretty much that Christian Judaism and Muslims pretty much living in the same city, country, by different laws. Do you think it was the case back then because Christians weren't committing adultery, Christians were eating, or was that the reason that Christians were able to?
No, they were eating. I mean, they were eating all sorts of stuff that Muslims couldn't eat. They were drinking wine. Muslims couldn't drink wine after 627 or about. They were, and by the way, everybody was committing adultery. I mean, not everybody. There was no community free of adultery. Let me rephrase that. So you have Muslims also committed adultery sometimes in the life of the Prophet. So I don't think it's based at all on some notion that everybody was better back then, or that other religious communities had morals that were closer to Islam. They were in the same culture, so yeah, they agreed with each other a lot more. But in important ways, they disagreed completely. So, Christians could still drink wine after Muslims. That's a big difference. After Muslims expanded outside of Arabia, they dealt with Christian communities where Christians can't have more than one wife, only one wife. Muslim men can have up to 4 wives if they treat all of them equally, which is very difficult. Yes.
I have a comment about something you mentioned earlier, the set of human that was talking to the priest that said,
We can't hear.
Oh, it's okay. I'll repeat the question.
the set of human that was talking to the Christian priest in Egypt and saying that, I know I don't love you, but that doesn't mean that there aren't a bunch of obligations that I have to do towards you. And what I understood is that perhaps you're saying that that is perhaps a valid kind of thing to say, that we don't necessarily have to love each other, but as long as we, do these obligations fulfill these obligations toward each other. But for me, that seems like we're kind of depriving, these obligations of the spirit. I mean, we listed a bunch of things that we owe our neighbors, to share happiness with them, to ask about them when they're sick, to help them out when they need help. Isn't that ultimately supposed to lead us to loving our neighbors? I mean, what's the point of doing all these things if we don't really love them? And what is the point of, the neighbor, the person who's receiving these acts, how is he supposed to appreciate those things if they don't have love?
This is a very good question. Excellent question. The question was, there's this model given by this Salafi scholar, Wahhabi scholar, about rights and obligations we have towards one another. But why? But if we're just doing these things because they're rights and obligations, aren't we kind of emptying them of any spirit, any moral spirit? And aren't we kind of empty people in a way? And why is this neighbor even, what's the point of all this if we're not pursuing the ultimate aim of loving one another? This is a good question, but I would ask you, and I ask myself this question a lot, so I don't have the answer. But I will try to assist you in the way I try to develop my own thoughts on the issue, which is that, one, why are we assuming that the ultimate goal is to love women? This seems like a fair assumption because it's the predominant assumption in our society. Right? I was at least culturally Christian for most of my life, and those reasons resonate very strongly with me. And I think they do with many people in America, because this is something that is held out there as a good that should be pursued. But my question is, why is that? Is it really because I'm supposed to love the bus driver or all my professors? I have to love them really as a person? Do I have to get to know them and see the beauty in them? Is that the goal we're really aiming for? Or is the goal we're aiming for, a peaceful, prosperous society where people can kind of go about their business, form relationships in the way they want to, in a stable way? And I don't know the answer to the question. I don't know the answer to the question, but I do know that I don't know of a lot of evidence in the Islamic tradition and the core scriptures of the Islamic tradition that would back up what you're arguing for. And then my question would be, if it's not there, and I may be wrong, maybe there is evidence there, but if it's not there, then you either have to accept that or explain why it's not there.
Are you familiar with the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ? It says the second part is وَلَا تُؤْمِنُوا
حتى يحب لأخيه ما يحب لنفسه.
That's not what I was going for. The one was حتى تحابوا, and then it says ألا أدلكم على شيء تعرفون تحاببتم أفشوا السلام بينكم.
What's this حب؟ الحب في إيه والبغض في إيه؟ الحب في الله والبغض في الله. These hadiths are very clear. Love, when the Prophet says loving one another, it's love in God, for God's sake, and dislike for God's sake. So you have to love in God, and if you love your neighbor in God, this is fine. But that's different from loving the person and accepting and loving everything they stand for, loving their beliefs, right?
In the back. Go ahead.
This is our question to work, but let's assume that some people who live in a society where the purple hair guys find it offensive to see purple haired people in the street. Okay? For example, like in France, people are saying that it's very offensive to see covered women. For a lot of Muslims, it might be offensive for people to see, for example, same-sex couples publicly displaying affection. Whereas for them, it's a right and it's something that they enjoy doing. So how would we, I'm not really sure how to word this question, but how would we, kind of like put it together? If, for example, we have something that's so far right, I can't expose my children, for example, to same-sex couples. I don't want to be seen same-sex couples in public. Whereas for them, as human beings, it's an expression of the self that this is important.
This is a really good question. This is how do you basically, our behaviors affect one another? And if we acknowledge difference in belief and difference in values, at what point are difference in values harming one another? So, yeah.
Because you also mentioned that for a lot of Muslim scholars, it wasn't so much what we did behind closed doors, it's what we did in public, and it's the same thing. For an adulterer, she will be adulterated behind closed doors, that's you, but if you have 4 witnesses, that, oh my God, that's probably needs to be punished, yeah. So it's the same thing with, how do you define what is allowed in public? I mean, we also have this discussion of what's too nude for public, what's too, wrong for public TV, for daylight television. So how do we reach a level with other big issues like purple hair and things?
This is a huge issue. And the question you're asking is how do societies come up with agreed upon conventions or criteria for determining what is acceptable or not acceptable in public space? Because public space affects everybody. So you could say that one answer could be, let's look at the minimum, the thing that offends nobody, and this is allowed. Anything beyond that is not allowed because somebody's going to get offended. That's one answer. But then somebody could say, wait a second, but I want to show something in public which is so core to my identity that if I'm not allowed to show this in public, this will affect my ability to really be myself. So we could say, like let's say in France, some people would say that women covering their face is offensive. It is deeply offensive to me. So I want this to be prohibited. Okay. But then a Muslim woman could say, wait a second, I want to follow an optional part of my religion that will allow me to be the best Muslim woman I think possible, and you're preventing me from achieving that. So this is a tension between what's called positive freedom and negative freedom. Legal language. So, negative freedom is saying we're not going to restrict people's rights. We're going to let people do whatever they want. Positive freedom means I have to be free to fulfill myself, and you have to allow me. You have to create a system, environment in which I can fulfill myself fully. Right. So if I have a right, let's say, to if every child has a right to education, it's not simply that I don't prevent people from going to school. It means I have to provide for people to have that right. So this is a tension between negative freedom and positive freedom. And that's a tension that every society deals with. And guess what it's ultimately decided by? It's decided by culture and by custom. In France, I saw this with my own teenage eyes, in France, women take off their tops at the beach. They bathe without their tops sometimes. In the United States, with the exception of a few beaches, you can't do that. You will be escorted away by a police officer or asked to dress yourself and perhaps arrested for public indecency. Now, French women, as far as I know, don't have campaigns talking about how American women are oppressed because they have to wear tops on the beach. But not a day goes by when I don't see on the news or read in the newspaper people talking about how Muslim women in Egypt, let's say, are going to be oppressed because they're going to be forced to wear a headscarf, possibly. I'm not saying it's going to happen. If that were to happen, that these women would be oppressed. Why is that an issue for Americans? Or for people in Western Europe? Because for people in America and Western Europe, this is very, being forced to wear a headscarf is a complete break with our Western European American dress norms as they exist today. And having somebody force that on you is bizarre and semi-barbaric. Whereas if you're in Egypt, where 80% of the women cover their hair already, it's much less, let's say, barbaric. It's much more conceivable that this would actually be required. So ultimately, things like this issue between positive freedom, negative freedom, these things are adjudicated by custom. And if custom changes, then the answer can change. So in this country, in the 1990s, the Supreme Court ruled that homosexual sex didn't enjoy any protection from the law. Within 10 years, they ruled that it did, because of change in the culture.
In the back, the baseball.
I really appreciate your talk. Thank you.
And here I sense a but.
Well, perhaps, I have been going to I'm part of the Mennonite church, okay? And I am, for years and years and years, I've been going to the Illinois conference of Mennonites, where we have a very narrow slice of humanity. And we disagree on almost everything we care about. So I know this one very well. I've also had a Turkish family that lived with me for a year. The woman is Sunni, the man is Alawite.
Ah, you emailed me.
I did that, yes. Yes, I did that. And I apologize. But I
What?
did that.
Nice email.
You know, it's like, in my experience, it's easier to have differences the wider apart you are. The closer you are together, the more you call yourself the same thing, and yet do not actually have the same practice. Whether one of my Muslim friends, for example, sits around and watches the spa and drinks beer on Sunday afternoon, nothing else happens. Right now, for a week together. He's a Muslim.
He is.
I mean, but it's not safe in Turkey often to be Alawi. It's not.
Oh, so he's Alawi, this person?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm telling, my point is that I do not know how, when I hear conversations about what Muslims think and what Christians think and what Jewish folks think in practice and or theology, and I have studied theology on all fronts because I personally do not know. This is not suggested or an academic matter. I just, what do you do with these fine differences that seem to make such hard?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great point. I mean, it's a phenomenon that it exists across religious traditions, across any kind of tradition I can think of. You know, the closer the siblings are, the more they hate each other. It's I think one word for it is mimetic blockage. So basically, you can't see the person you hate the most. You can't see that they're actually exactly like you. Right? You know, I think that the principle that Muslim scholars have tried to follow, and they've succeeded sometimes and failed other times. Muslim scholars write oral nasty books against each other on the slightest difference in how you pray. You pray like this or like this. You say a certain thing out loud in prayer, not really nasty book titles to which each other controversial. But in general, the principle that they should follow, which they articulate, is that within the fold of Islam, people who believe in the major tenets of the religion, you don't want to declare someone non-Muslim unless they break with one of those major tenets of the religion. Otherwise, within that, there's difference of opinion which is recognized. And the position of a Muslim scholar is that I believe I'm correct, there's a possibility that I'm wrong. I believe that you are wrong, other Muslim scholar with the possibility that you are correct. And acknowledging that all their different schools of thought are legitimate. And unless the people involved sort of get a nasty case of certainty or start seeing really nasty things in others, in their other Muslim brethren, they usually follow that.
Somebody.
Who's had their hand up for sister? Yeah.
Thank you for coming today. And I was just wondering, so towards the end of your talk, you mentioned how in this country and in this age, religion is kind of more private matter, and so as such, apostasy is not necessarily the threat to structuralists.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, how does that extend to like religious critiques that attack, such as like the movies and the cartoons, and from your position, how do you feel that really affects the religious Islam, if it does at all, and how Muslim Americans here?
Yeah. Well, you know, I think.
Did you repeat the question?
So the question was, she said that, you know, I said that in this country, at this, because other parts of the world, religious identification is still very important. So I'm not going to, in the United States, Western Europe, religious identification is much more a matter of personal conscience. It doesn't affect social order so much. So how do we then, what does that mean about how we deal with things like people insulting Islam or making movies like the movie about the Prophet?
Right, like things that go beyond just typical
Yeah.
dialogue or critique, things that are actually hurtful and are justified by.
Yeah, freedom of speech. I mean, that's a good question. And, I think probably a lot of Muslims in this country were trying to wrap their heads around that movie made about the Prophet and what do they say about it. Because, it's really interesting actually. Gallup company polling done in Egypt and Indonesia and Iran. Over 90% in those three countries, over 90% of those people polled wanted and believed that freedom of speech should be enshrined in their constitutions. By the way, the new Egyptian constitution, which is causing so much trouble, actually has unrestricted freedom of speech. I don't understand. Go read the Constitution. You can't insult the prophet. That's any prophet. That's another clause of the Constitution. But it's they took freedom of speech very seriously. So I think I'll tell you this. I think as an American and as a Muslim, I believe in freedom of speech probably more strongly than the U.S. government and the Supreme Court does. I believe really in freedom of speech to say whatever you want, if it's politically unpopular, if it's supporting an organization the U.S. government doesn't like, it's still, in my opinion, protected. What I think is interesting about the movie about the Prophet is not whether or not it's freedom of speech or not. It's inconsistencies about how freedom of speech is applied. When there's a case called Virginia versus Black, a Supreme Court case. And in this case, it was decided that, so burning a cross is active expression. In general, this would be allowed. But if you do this, Virginia passed a law against this, and the Supreme Court upheld it. If you do this in the close to African American community, with the intention of scaring this community, with the intention of sending an immediate threat, then this would be fair to prohibit this active expression. Why is that? Why is it that this case, this exception is made? Because of the historical experience of Virginia, of the South, of the African American community in this country, because of slavery, because of attacks on blacks, because of lynching, because of what burning cross means. Because it means something in American collective memory. The same reason that in Germany, or it's illegal to distribute Nazi propaganda, or in France, or in Holland, or in Belgium, it's illegal to deny the Holocaust because of the specific experiences that those countries have had. Now, what Muslims have been asking for since the cartoon crisis in 2005, 2006, is to have their sensitivities accepted as well. Say, we're part of America, 7% of France is Arab, 5% of Germany is Turkish. In America, anywhere from 1 to 3% of the population is Muslim. I'm not exactly sure. But these groups are saying, we're part of your societies, we're part of these societies, and we would like our sensitivities respected too. Yes, you technically can insult the Prophet, but why do it? Why do you want to hurt me? Why do you want to hurt us? We're Americans too. And what you saw, for example, YouTube's policy, you can go on their website, and it says they do not accept hate speech. Things that insult a racial group, an ethnic group, a religious group, sexual orientation, class, society, they'll remove these. These are not allowed on their site. And they pulled down, I give you lots of examples, they pulled down anti-Semitic sites, they pulled down over the sites that are overly racist against blacks, they pulled down anything they considered to be hate speech. They did not believe that this movie, Innocence of Muslims, was hate speech. Now, part of my research, I've read about pretty much every single negative thing ever written about the Prophet Muhammad since the year 632 until today. Okay? This movie broke new ground in offensiveness. These guys were very creative. Whatever they were doing, they really sat down and got out a whiteboard and were coming up with ideas, workshopping stuff. They had stuff in this movie which had never been said before. It's just incredibly offensive. How can the most offensive thing that's ever been made about the Prophet Muhammad, how can that not qualify as hate speech? 1.5 billion people in the world are going to be very hurt by this. the founder of a religion. This isn't hate speech. That strikes me as very inconsistent. So that's what I think what Americans, Muslims, I think Americans overall should do is not say that your speech should be restricted, but say, listen, if you're going to respect the sensibilities of certain communities, respect the sensibilities of all communities. Don't disrespect Muslims just because it's popular to do that right now, or just because Muslims are seen as bad guys. Because we're Americans too. And even if we're not Americans, we're human beings too.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming here, and Allah bless you. One of the things that I wanted to, if you can kind of elaborate a little bit on, is this Sharia phobia. That all of a sudden, I mean, basically the Sharia of the Christians, they have their own Sharia, and the Jews have their own Sharia, and then they don't understand the Muslims have their own Sharia. Is that, could you just kind of...
Yeah, I don't understand Sharia phobia. I think it's very weird. I can't figure it out. I mean, do people actually think that... So the fear is that Muslims are trying to take over America with Sharia, correct? That's the fear? I don't understand how that would happen. I mean, how would that... Do you think that Muslims are going to put on like white guy masks and go into the local legislature and pass a bill saying, we make Sharia the law of land, and run out and hope nobody notices? Really, I don't understand how it happened. In America, the law of the United States, the law of the United States is the law of the land. The law of the state and the law of the federal government is the law of the land. And there's no way you can alter that. In addition, I mean, people think Sharia is like chopping people's hands off and things like that. I mean, I don't know. I can't think of any instance, with a few exceptions in the modern period, I can't think of any instance where actually someone had their hand chopped off. This is a punishment that is designed to frighten people into not steal. Because, guess what? Before modern states, countries don't have police forces. Countries don't have enough resources and communications to go and police all little communities in their country. So how is law and order maintained? I mean, for example, in England, there wasn't a police force in England until 1830. How is law maintained in order maintained? It's maintained through social control. It's maintained through threats of violence. Because actually the state doesn't have the infrastructure to carry out punishments. So if you look at English law from like 1760s into the early 1800s, there's over 160 death penalty offenses. Over 160 death penalty offenses. For things like stealing someone's shoe buckles when they're drunk. For things like taking fish out of their fish pond. This is death penalty offense. Why? Because how the heck else are you going to scare people away from doing it? Because there's no way that the government of England or that county is going to be able to go and find the guy who stole your shoe buckles. So this idea that Sharia is this kind of gruesome punishment, this is nonsense. In fact, if you look at the Ottoman, let's take Ottoman Empire, Istanbul in the 1800s, the 1700s, for example. No one ever got to the point in a trial where they got their hand chopped off for stealing anything. Because the evidentiary requirements for it are so high that no one got their hand chopped off. Well, then you say, what's the point of this? How does the judge deal with it? Anything in Islamic law that doesn't reach the level of these hudud punishments, the punishment that has a mandated punishment set by God, like having your hand cut off for theft, anything that doesn't meet the evidentiary requirements for that is just handled by the judge according to the judge's discretion. So the person is fined, the person is smacked on the face a few times, the person's made, in Istanbul, for example, they made them carry firewood all night until the next morning. So that's how. And instead, people have this idea that this is all Sharia is. For Muslims, when they pray, that's Sharia. When they fast for Ramadan, that's Sharia. When they give their charity money, that's Sharia. When they're kind to their parents, that's Sharia. This is all Sharia. So if someone says you can't practice Sharia, well, that means I can't pray. It means I can't fast. It means I can't give charity. By the way, it means you can't. If you're a Muslim, you can't live in that place. It's not according to Sharia. You can't live in that place. So some So the state wants to pass a law saying that Sharia is prohibited here or something. Then you know what? They're going to miss out on all the good doctors and engineers who happen to be Muslim who live there. And those doctors and engineers will go find work elsewhere. That's my thing.
Have your hand up for this one.
You contrasted pre-modern conception of faith, I guess identity, with modern conception of identity, faith, in the context of the law.
Modern Western.
Well, okay, let's set that aside, because there's overlap. I'm curious, would you agree that, would you accept the premise that, descent, religious identities, at least psychologically and culturally today, are in flux in some respects, in a very postmodern era, we're very fragmented, get our sources of our information, our culture, they're very mixed sources of information today. Does that have any implications, do you think, for these very static categories, village style categories, senses of religious belonging, and in other words, canon isn't blurrier today than it was in the past.
I mean, I think that, there's always times, and I've never studied an era of history where you don't eventually come across some person who just looks exactly like somebody today. Saying exactly the kind of snide, cynical thing, making fun of religion, making fun of it. But in general, I mean, secularization occurred. Secularization. In England in 1800, religion, religious values, religious identity was much more important than it was in England in 1900. Right? For some, let's take Cairo for example, in the news today. For some people in Cairo, religion is not important today, and for their great-grandparents it was, or even for their parents it was. For other people in Cairo, religion is probably more important than it was 50 years ago, or 60 years ago, or 100 years ago. Because the more identity is threatened, the tighter we cling to it. The more we see other people leaving our group, the harsher we make the punishments for leaving that group. The harsher we judge others. And this goes both ways, right? Whether it's a secular community or a religious community. So I mean, I think that you're without a doubt correct that the boundaries are blurrier, but at the same time, the people inside the communities want to make the boundaries firmer. They want to make the boundaries firmer. And that creates a recipe for fragmentation in society that is very hard to counteract. It's very hard to counteract. And you have to have institutions that are strong enough to bear that. In the United States, thank God, at least till now, we have institutions that are strong enough, whether it's a constitution, whether it's electoral process. If we look at other countries that have been, where institutions of government or civil society have been corrupted, have been dominated by dictators or plutocrats, and it's very hard for them to pass through these times of crisis.
Would you please comment on the following, going back to the issue about Sharia? Now, to my knowledge, in Islamic Sharia, the state cannot implement whatever, chopping hands or doing whatever, unless it actually provides the conditions for the people. So when the state says that, okay, people have enough to eat now, anyone who steals, I'll chop his hand off. Now that, in my opinion, necessitates that the state itself has the ability to actually police itself. And I think, in fact, that actually happened very early on in the Islamic history. What do you think?
So you're referring to the year of famine, which the Caliph Omar. So the Caliph Omar ibn al-Khattab was the second Caliph, second ruler of the Muslim community after the Prophet. He ruled from 634 to 644, the common era. And during 1 year of his caliphate, there was a famine, a drought, and he suspended any punishments for theft during that year. And so you're asking, the state, there have to be, the condition of the society has to be such that Sharia can actually be implemented. That's true, but in general, through Islamic history, Muslim polities generally did not see, having no poor people or having no hungry people as being a requirement for instituting at least the possibility of the corporal and capital punishments. But what they did do is in the schools of, let's say the Hanafi school of law, which is the Sunni school of law, which predominated in the Ottoman Empire in South Asia, India, Pakistan. I mean, any food stuff you steal, you can't be punished for with a head punishment, with a hand chop. Any food stuff is automatically off the table for causing that kind of punishment. So even if that's not the condition they set up about saying there's no poverty, no famine, therefore now we can finally implement these punishments, even if they don't have that requirement, there are other conditions in place that make it very difficult for the same kind of punishment to occur. In other words, make it very difficult for someone who's stolen food to be punished in any severe way. Oh, by the way, sorry, just one good example of this is slavery. There's a great letter. It's translated in English. If anyone wants it, I can email it to you. A letter of the governor of Tunis, governor of the capital of Tunisia, Tunis, to the American consulate in the year 1860, arguing with telling the American consular official that America needs to ban slavery. Now, in Islamic law, in general, slavery is allowed. Slavery is allowed in Islamic law. But the Muslim scholars in Tunis had looked at the situation, the conditions. So in Islamic law, in slavery, you can't kill a slave, you can't starve a slave, you can't overwork the slave, you have to clothe the slave, you have to house the slave, you have to treat the slave nicely, right? The slave can buy himself or herself back if they want. So what they did is they looked at these situations, they looked at how slavery was actually being practiced, and they said none of these conditions are being met. So because in our society we are unable to actually have Sharia-compliant slavery, we have to ban slavery. So they banned it, and then they sent a letter to the American consulate saying that Americans should ban slavery too. It's very interesting.
I guess we'll take one last question.
What I'm wondering is, in the age of globalization, how can something like fundamentalism, Islam, how can that coordinate globalization nowadays?
Well, I mean, fundamentalism and globalization are they're sort of isomorphic. I mean, they're inevitably coupled with each other. If one culture, global consumer capitalism, Western consumer capitalism, Western liberal democracy, if this becomes dominant, other forms of identity that are threatened will retreat into these shells of fundamentalism. Fundamentalism, traditional local beliefs, that are reactions often to encroachment of things like imperial forces, like globalism. And I say imperial here not to sort of say imperialist, although that might be accurate, but imperial in the sense that they just control, they take control, they see and stuff. So there's this book is old now, but I've never read a book that's as useful as it for understanding this. It's the book Jihad versus New World by Benjamin Barber. I recommend this book, Jihad versus New World. It's an excellent book. So fundamentalism, in fact, if you want to, if one wants to ratchet down the danger of fundamentalism, or fundamentalist violence, the best way to do it is to pull back on cultural imperialism, to pull back on economic imperialism, to give people a sense that they are actually able to determine their own destiny. You'll find suddenly, I guarantee you, you'll find suddenly that they're not so attached to fundamentalist claims. They become more relaxed because they're no longer feeling under threat. Their identity is no longer being threatened.
Would you say in 1979, the Islamic Revolution?
I mean, that's a great example. Yeah, but I mean, Afghanistan is another example. Al-Qaeda as an organization is an example.
because maybe Iranian revolution there's so many sanctions against them, international outcry against them. That's what I'm really worried about, because if Islam comes the way that it will be against them.
Yeah. I mean, there's certainly an argument to that. I mean, an argument would be that the more people tell, the more the international community, the global international community tells the Iranian government that they have to give up their program of nuclear weapons, the more entrenched they will be in their ideology and in the pursuit of those nuclear weapons. The bet of countries like the United States, Israel, countries that support the sanctions, is that you can cripple the country beforehand, or make the government so terrified of popular uprising or popular discontent that they will in fact discontinue the program. That's the gamble. And I don't know which one is correct. But certainly both are possible. One last question.
Actually, it's not a question. Just a comment on
We're missing out half the conversation.
All right, I'll repeat it.
just have a comment on the statement that you said at the end. Slavery is allowed in Islam. As a matter of fact, it's not allowed in Islam. When Islam came at the beginning, slavery was an economic, social, political system that Islam has to deal with it. Even though Islam restricted the resources for slavery and put many of the measures that, for many of the mistakes, that the only to get yourself out of this mistake by freeing slavery. And right now, with the international laws, Islam advocates and recognizes the international laws. So in Islam, slavery is not allowed. It was the universal system at the time, and Islam dealt with it in a very realistic way, and even advocated to free the slaves. I think so.
I mean, certainly in saying that I was mistaken in saying that Islam allows slavery, because Islam does not allow slavery, because slavery was in a sort of assumed economic condition or worldwide when Islam arose, and that the Quran and the Prophet urged and taught Muslims to free slaves as an act of charity, to free slaves to make up for sins they committed, and that the eventual aim being to do away with the institution. I mean, it's very clear that the Quran and the Prophet taught that emancipating slaves was a very good deed. But the problem with that argument is that Islam banned all sorts of other things that were very prevalent, like drinking alcohol, like eating pork, right? Like eating animals slaughtered not slaughtered in a specific way. So, I mean, if you're living, especially in a place like India, I mean, I remember just in some village in India where Muslims lived, there were pigs that were so big they could have eaten meat, knocked me over, eaten. I mean, they were huge. In Southeast Asia, pigs are a major part of the economy. In Northern Europe, pigs are a very important part of the economy. So is drinking beer. To the medieval European, especially Irish diet, drinking beer is an important part of where they get their calories. Now, if Muslims went there, and they did go to India, and they did go to Southeast Asia, and Islam spread there, Muslims had to stop eating pigs. Muslims had to stop raising pigs. Muslims had to stop drinking alcohol, right? Muslims had to stop drinking alcohol in Europe when they became Muslim. So, Islam doesn't, the Quran and the Prophet didn't have any compunction about banning outright certain activities. They didn't do that with slavery. Now, that may be because there's some wisdom behind that maybe it would have been economically traumatic, maybe slavery is in fact still around. Maybe slavery is not about someone being called a slave. Maybe slavery is about certain people being in economic situations where they're effectively helpless. Maybe that's always around, whether we call it slavery or not. Maybe that's what we're supposed to fight. I don't know. But I wish I could make the argument you make, but there's other instances in which the Quran very clearly prohibited this category.
Just, we can take any other questions offline. Dr. Urbana is going to make some closing remarks. No closing remarks, just presenting a... Really? Oh, that's so nice. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's a picture of me. our speaker for a wonderful talk. Again, I'd like to remind you that the surveys, please, we have volunteers at the doors that will be collecting the surveys. They're very important for us to know what the quality of the event was like, what you thought of the event, and all that. So please fill out the surveys and hand them to our volunteers. Thank you for coming out tonight.